It's that time of year. The season's material has been released. But first, welcome back to our channel, Lions FL Mentoring. We're a former FL team from France. My name is Dorian.
My name is Claire, and now, without further ado, let's dig into the new season. The theme of the season this year is Unearthed, so it's about archaeology and uncovering artifacts of the past. I think initially I was really amazed that that was going to be the theme. I think I would have absolutely loved that season because when I was younger, I was obsessed with history and archaeology. So I would definitely have been super psyched for this one. And how about you, Dorian?
Yeah, definitely same. I'm currently actually double majoring in mechanical engineering and history at university, so history is definitely something that I'm really interested in. And I think it's really cool that they're bringing up these questions.
All right, so the big release was on August 5th. So obviously, we had to be making a video about this today. And that's when they gave us all the material that you're going to need for this new season.
So let's start with the new map, which is often the star of the show. It has already been displayed at the Worlds last season and shown during the season reveal video a few months back. But here's our first full look at the mat. Before we look at the missions in detail, let's talk about the layout of the mat itself. Something you want to think about looking at the mat is navigation and what sensors you can rely on where. To look at it, it can be useful to have an overhead view of the mat that we've provided on the right, and also we wanted to show you the wireframe layout on the left, which is available in the season resources. Let's talk about sensor usage with regards to navigation. By the way, if you're new to FL and discovering what the different sensors are, we're releasing a second episode of our Lions FL guide the same time as this video. First, I'd say that the gyro and counting the number of turns on the wheel, so wheel counts, is probably going to be at the core of your navigation this season, which itself isn't too surprising since that's a staple, especially since the new Spike robots have been released. Also, for the wheel counts, the season resources include a version of the wireframe here to show you the grid, and you can either use that and a tape measure to kind of figure out the distances and make that easier on yourselves for navigation.
There could be a few opportunities this year to use the touch sensor, for example, against the silo. So the touch sensor can be a good place to start for a lot of beginner teams since it is the most straightforward sensor to use. Of course, that will depend on whether or not you can establish a strategy where you use that sensor enough times to justify choosing it. Because while you theoretically can use as many sensors as you want during a match, realistically, having to switch sensors in the middle of a match is very time consuming and can be really stressful. So it's something you generally want to avoid. There's also the ultrasonic sensor. Honestly, we never really used it, but maybe you can use it to stay a steady distance from one of the border walls, for example, this year. And then that brings us to the last type of sensor you can use in FLL, color sensors. We're seeing a shift in the design of mats over the last couple of years. Whereas before Submerged, there were really long lines that you could follow with the color sensors. That is no longer the case, as you can see here today. Of course, you can still use the few lines that remain to know where you are. For example, you can use them to stop at a specific place, or you can use them to adjust your alignment by squaring on the line. However, please be careful. We made a close-up of certain areas in the background next to the lines. You will notice that the colors of the background are very similar to the white part of the lines. So in your algorithms, please make sure that you're mostly relying on detecting the black part of the line because the white part can be a little bit trickier this year around.
And just as we've been seeing in previous years, there are two homes on the mat this year. So that fact and the fact that it's a smaller mat means that there should be less issues for teams in terms of restricting themselves to certain missions for time constraints because they can't afford to go too far, as we've seen in previous years with only one home and with distances being very, very far, especially when you're up on the, say, northeast corner of the mat. Of course, that means you have to be mindful of the rules on the placement of technicians, especially if you're a small team of just two or three, because you don't really get a lot of choice. and have to have at least one team member that needs to run a area alone, say one on each side. So we'd heavily encourage you to use both of these home areas because it makes different missions easier to access. And also, all the technicians have to kind of have a part to play in the actual robot game itself, which is really exciting and kind of like more of like a core values aspect. But also, I mean, it's less switching out, especially for the larger teams. So now let's look at two important points in terms of the layout of the mat and some rules. Before the start of the match, all your equipment and robot must fit inside both of the launch areas and under a height limit of 12 inches or 30.5 centimeters. And you get a bonus if it fits inside just one of the launch areas with the same height restriction rather than two. We really encourage you to go for this bonus, especially if you're having a hard time scoring points on the match, or maybe you're new to FLL, just to get some points out of the way from the start. Once upon a time, that sort of limit didn't exist, and for example, a strategy would be to have massive attachments. So some of which we leave on the mat once we've completed the mission, so often right up against the mission models. This is something that FLA has been turning away from since are missions marked with this logo right here in the rulebook, which cannot score points if equipment is touching that mission model at the end of the match. So something you could do in the past with those attachments was essentially have them be chariots that your robot pushed, kind of guided by the wall. And since there are less border walls with these new map designs, this is also kind of a change from the previous system. Um, However, that brings us to the last kind of navigational aid, which it was following the walls in some sort of way.
As you can see, there are 15 missions that are pretty well spread out over the map, especially given the size of the map. Although looking at the overview and the resources that we have here, you can see that there might be various ways of grouping them geographically. For example, you could go up from the east base and tackle the missions in the northeast in the same launch, or you could be doing missions 12 and 11 in a launch that essentially just goes from one launch area to another. And by the way, those are some of the things that you can consider when you're thinking about your strategy or when you're thinking about how you are going to organize the different launches that you do during a match. For example, you can group missions geographically, like we just mentioned, or maybe you can think about them in a way thematically by the sort of motion that you're using to complete those missions. Of course, you can also do that by how difficult a mission seems to complete. So that can be by what order you would tend to tackle the missions in, for example, to ensure a sort of quick win, quote unquote, strategy to start securing points soon in the season, especially if you are getting your mats really late. Also, one thing to note is that you don't have to do a mission completely all at once. So you might do one part while you're going one way and then complete the other part on the way back. For example, if the movements that you're doing are more convenient that way. So we're not going to be very original, and we are going to cover the missions in the order they're presented in the robot game rules and in the video. I tried to make information sheets to sum up our opinion on the missions. So that's going to include, is it drive-by scoring compatible? And what we mean by drive-by scoring is, can you get it done quickly on the way to another mission, maybe by doing it in multiple parts, like I was just mentioning? Also, how easy does that mission seem? Knowing that we have often used easier said than done as our team motto. So what appears easy on video might be much trickier in real life. So this is mostly in case you're looking for that quick win approach, like if you're getting the mat late in the season, or you want to make sure that you're getting points quickly, or you are a newer team, then those are the missions that we would recommend you tackle first. But of course, we could be wrong. And also another thing that we wanted to mention is if there's a specific time, you might consider doing that mission during the match. For example, if it relies on another mission or if it needs to happen after another mission. And finally, we will be talking about if there seems to be a way that you could be doing that mission passively, meaning that you don't need a motor specifically for that movement and that mission. Of course, everything that we are going to be showing you are just suggestions. Please remember also that you don't need to complete all the missions, so feel free to just skip some of our recommendations, especially in terms of timing, if that doesn't apply to your strategy.
So now let's move on to the actual mission by mission breakdown. So let's move on to mission one. Mission one is the surface brushing. So essentially what it is that there's this brush that can be swung left and right to drop solid deposits. And if they are completely cleared, that is 10 points for each solid deposit on the side. And then if you remove the archaeologist brush and it's not touching the dig site, that's an additional 10 points. So in terms of the apparent difficulty, the deposits seem pretty easy, although the brush itself with its small axle is a pretty small target. Um, Grabbing the brush itself becomes harder because you need to grab the axis instead of just sliding by it. In terms of drive-by scoring, the deposits kind of potentially could be done in two parts. For example, going one way towards the north and then coming back down to the south. Or it could be done just back and forth just to get that out of the way. The brush probably couldn't be done that way just because of the grabbing and lifting motion. And in terms of timing, if you're doing the brush, it's probably best to do it before mission 14. Um, and it can be done fairly easy. Otherwise, if you're not doing that, if you're just doing the deposits, say if you're driving up to the north. Now, in terms of the passive options, the deposits potentially can be done just by driving by, as I mentioned previously.
Mission two is a map reveal, and in that mission, you need to remove three sections. So the first one on the left needs to be pushed and turned away. The one at the very back needs to be pushed back in the light green frame that you're seeing on the screen. And then the one in the right and in the front needs to be grabbed by the loop and lifted clearly out of the green frame. I feel like the left one is the most accessible out of those three, and it's maybe the easiest to try to tackle in that mission. Whereas it's true that the one in the back might be harder to reach, and the one on the right has one of those small loops that can easily be missed if you're not very well aligned on the mission model. In terms of the location, since it's in the northwest corner, it's probably less likely to be something that you can do in terms of drive-by scoring. And then one thing to note for the timing is that if you decide to pick up the front one, then you want to do this mission before mission 14, so you get a chance to drop it off in the forum. Of course, I feel like this mission can be done fairly early, especially if you're starting in the West launch area, because often a strategy that we see a lot of teams do is start in launch area and drive straight up north to start securing points that are close to that launch area very early on in the match. In terms of passive option, of course, I feel like the left one is a type of mission that you can try to tackle passively, having a sort of wedge or something to push it out of the way at floor level. For the one in the back, I'd say maybe you can try to push it back with a pull if you're really heading straight for it. Another thing I will hint at, but I can't guarantee since I don't have a mat in front of me, is that you could maybe check out if you can actually align that with the loop of the right part of soil. And then finally, for the one on the right, I think it is less likely that you will be able to rely on a passive option. For example, one type of passive option that you could definitely look at, and that's really fun to play around with, are one-way gates. The issue we've had with that type of loop is that it's very flimsy. And so using a one-way gate often means that the loop just bends out of the way and you don't actually manage to grab it.
Mission three is the Mine Shaft Explorer. So, to score points here, basically, you have to push up the railing, and if your team's minecart is on the opposing team's field, so it's slid across on this tournament-style table, which will be used for the actual competitions themselves, then that's 30 points. And you get a bonus of 10 points if the opposing team's minecart is on your field. So kind of that's an incentive to work with the other team. In terms of apparent difficulty, lifting the bar itself is a generally simple motion, but you should be careful not to bump into the model itself. And it's also a risk of knocking down the support for mission 4, which is to the left, the support structures. In terms of drive-by scoring, it's not really likely due to the location along the north border, but you could consider combining it with Mission 4. So that's once again looking at missions that are geographically similar and combining them. In terms of timing, try doing it earlier since it's a competition mission. So what that means is that the earlier you do it, the more time you give the team on the other side of the tournament style match tables time to grab it and then put it into the forum, which gives them an additional 5 points. So that's all about cooperation there. Um, and in terms of passive options, it's not really likely due to the angle needed to raise these rails. Um, though you could try exploring a really harsh passive solution.
Mission 4 is paired with Mission 3. It's the careful recovery. So there you need to reach below the structure and grab the precious artifact, which is probably the hardest mission this year. The artifact seems pretty small and pretty difficult to reach from the side, and I'm guessing you're probably going to have to consider a lot of different angles or different heights to be able to grab it from. And for the support structures, which only give you an extra 10 points, they seem to be really difficult and really flimsy to not knock them off and to lose those 10 points. In terms of drive-by scoring, I'd say due to the location and due to the precision needed, it doesn't seem really likely that you'll be able to do this while going somewhere else. Of course, in terms of timing, I'd say that you can combine this with Mission 3, which is right on top of it. And another thing to note is that you want to make sure that you do this before Mission 14 if you want to bring back a precious artifact to your base and later on take it to the forum. In terms of passive options, I'd say usually the issue with passive options is that you need to be very careful while navigating. And so, due to a precision that you need for this mission, it doesn't seem as simple or as likely to be able to do this passively.
Mission 5 is Who Lived Here. So there's this structure that has been overturned, and you get 30 points if the structure floor has been moved completely upright using the red tab right here. It's a sliding tab. So in terms of apparent difficulty, the red bar is pretty small, but sliders can be pushed in different ways, and it is a pretty simple motion in itself. Um, this could definitely be a passive option, and maybe even part of the robot as it kind of goes through or pushes during its navigation towards another mission. In terms of drive-by scoring, you could maybe do it while going or leaving the northeast corner. And timing, consider grouping geographically with missions 7 and 8 as a way of kind of optimizing your navigation.
Mission 6 is the Forge mission. So you need to hit the red pole to release the ore blocks, and you get 10 points for each of the ore blocks that is released. The only thing I note about the difficulty of this mission is that once again, we're seeing a pretty small target. It's just one stud wide. So you want to be careful. And for example, that might influence your choosing a passive option or not. Of course, if you have something sticking out of your robot or maybe a sort of wedge that allows you to push that beam, you could try that. But since it is a small target, you will have to be very careful when it comes to navigating if you decide to do it passively in particular. In terms of it being drive-by scoring compatible or not, I'd say this isn't as likely because it's placed in a corner, but of course, once again, make sure that you're looking at the map strategically and seeing which missions you can combine if you're already in that area. For the timing, this mission can also allow you to retrieve inside the ore blocks a fossilized artifact. The thing is that you need time to take those blocks back to base, open them up, find the artifact, and then have time to bring that artifact to the forum for mission 14. So you definitely want to think about how long it's going to take your technicians to open the blocks and find the right one and go through the motions of completing that part of mission 14.
Mission 7 is the heavy lifting. So basically, this is a millstone, and there's this big loop that you should grab. And if the millstone is no longer touching its base at all, you get 30 points. So, in terms of apparent difficulty, while this loop is definitely a more sturdy loop than the one that we've mentioned before, um, with the map mission, for example, reaching over the model might be difficult as it really is in the full northeast corner behind another mission model. In terms of drive-by scoring, we really don't see how this is possible due to the placement in the corner behind the model, but it could be combined geographically with that model to optimize your navigation. Timing, it should probably be done before mission 14 once again to be able to put it in the forum. And in terms of passive options, it's less likely due to the placement that we've mentioned, the fact that you'll have to be reaching over to grab it, although you could explore some other solutions there.
And then mission 8 is the catapult mission this year. Well, it means that you need to take the preserved pieces inside a silo and toss them out of that using the red tab you're seeing there. It is a very small target since, once again, you only have one stud, which does seem to be a pattern this year, but it is a fairly repetitive motion at a pretty convenient height. So that doesn't seem as hard due to the motion. One thing to note is that while you can be doing it on the way to the northeast corner, where you have a lot of emissions that we just mentioned, you will probably still need to stop there to complete it because you need to repeat that motion. In terms of timing, of course, beside thinking about combining it, I'd say another thing you have to keep in mind is that you have to think about the worst case scenario sometimes and consider whether or not these pieces, which are going to be thrown out and end up scattered somewhere on the mat, could make your robot's wheels slip or if it could make them jam in certain missions. Of course, you never think it's going to happen because it's such a small piece. And then, if things can go wrong on the match table, they very well might. Another thing that you want to point out is that you want to find the right balance between spending time. For example, how long does it take for you to hit the tab for one piece to be released and then for the next piece to drop down? Because whether or not you decide that you're going to spend all the time you need to throw out the free pieces or if you're going to stop at just one or two, depending on how long you have left in your match. And I'd say that since there is a tapping motion to complete, you're probably going to need some sort of motor to be able to activate that motion. So it will probably not be a mission where you try to do something passively.
Mission number 9 is what's on sale. So basically, this is a old market that you are going to attempt to restore. If the roof is completely raised by pushing on the red bar right there, that is 20 points. And if the market wares are raised by using the axle on the left, that's 10 points. So in terms of the apparent difficulty, the roof is easier because it's a fairly wide target and a relatively simple motion, whereas the wares are harder because it's smaller target, just an axle, as we mentioned previously with the brush, for example. Um, but be careful not to get entangled in the table with the wares or any other part of the model in this mission. In terms of drive-by scoring, the roof could be done, especially if you're driving in the right direction, potentially from the northeast corner. The wares, this is a less likely solution I see, because the motion seems harder to do and probably requires stopping for a certain time to actually do that motion. Timing, there's nothing in particular that we wanted to mention. Just think about grouping the missions as we've mentioned previously. And then in terms of passive options, the roof can definitely be pushed while going in a certain direction with the robot, whereas the wares are hard to do because of the motion. Now this is another, I just wanted to briefly mention the difference in points between the roof and the market wares, just because we think that this is a good way to talk about looking at points versus time and difficulty. This is a mission where your team might think, well, the roof is a relatively simple motion and a large target for 20 points that we can do passively, so let's definitely do that. Whereas the wares are only 10 points for a more difficult motion and more difficult target. So that's something that you might kind of wait until later or maybe not do at all.
Mission 10 is tip the scales, and it actually follows the same pattern what Dorian was just saying about choosing wisely which parts you do depending on the amount of points you get, because it looks like while the scale is a small enough target to hit, It seems like a fairly simple motion to be able to tap it out of the way, whereas the simplicity of a pan will depend on how easy it is to grab and drag the pan out. In terms of drive-by scoring, for example, it looks like the scale, if it is sensitive enough to be tipped over when you just nudge it, is something you could consider doing while you're driving by. Whereas for the pan, of course, maybe you can try to drag it along, but you have to be careful that if you're not heading straight back to base at that very second, you could lose it along the way while you're navigating around the mat. Definitely in terms of timing, once again, think about doing it before mission 14 if you're trying to drag a pan back home and then use it for that mission. As for passive options, that's why I was mentioning, was saying that you could tap the scale out of the way. That is a way to do it while you're driving by. But for a pan, you're probably going to need to lower something to reach for a pan. But of course, there are plenty of passive ways that you could think about to trigger that motion.
Mission 11 is the Angler Artifacts mission. So basically, the artifacts are the little brown piece that you see attached to the crane. And then the ground layer is the tan, and then the brown pieces that are just two studs tall attached to the mat. Now, if you raise the artifacts above this ground layer by pushing that red tab to the right, um, you will be getting 20 points. And if the crane flag is at least partially lowered, so that's the blue piece on the very end of the crane, if it's partially lowered, that's a 10-point bonus. In terms of the apparent difficulty, it looks like a pretty simple and repetitive motion, but we just wanted to point out that your team should make sure to go far back enough for it to um, actually reset. In terms of drive-by scoring, it might be a little detour depending on where you are and where you're going, and will likely require stopping to repeat the motion enough times to raise the artifacts. So that kind of rules out some of the passive options that people might be considering, although the robot could move to activate it itself. In terms of timing, you really need to find the right balance between securing the points and maybe even forgetting the bonus, depending on the time you spent there. So that's what I was mentioning earlier and what Claire touched on again. It's really, okay, we can get 20 points by just tapping it a few times to get it above the ground layer, but really waiting for the flag to go down, depending on how long that actually takes, might not actually be worth it.
Mission 12 is the salvage operation, and so it is in two parts. First, and you do want to do that first because you need to get that red T-shaped bar away from the ship and past a certain point. You can use that to clear away the sand, and then you want to push against a red tab to move the ship away and raise it from that area, and that gives you 10 points. The sand might be harder to reach or to grab onto, whereas the ship seems to be easier to reach and it seems to be a wider target. But you do want to make sure that you're not getting tangled up in the hull of the ship itself, since those two things seem to be really close. Definitely, in terms of timing, you want to do the sand first and then the ship. And I'd say that the issue is that the sand is pretty far away, so it might be a little harder to do in terms of drive-by scoring, and it might be harder to pull passively as well. Whereas the ship seems easier to do in a drive-by sort of pattern, and definitely if you're close enough and properly aligned, you can do this essentially passively.
Mission 13 is the statue rebuild mission. So the statue is initially kind of lying against the mat, and if it is completely raised, that's 30 points. So in terms of apparent difficulty, it's really hard to judge on the video if you can only activate it using the little three stud red piece there. Um, but maybe you can use other parts of the statue. Though the no pieces at the end of the match rule will definitely remove some options for raising it. In terms of drive-by scoring, it's less likely due to this motion, but it can be once again grouped geographically with the missions around it. In terms of timing, it's hard to tell how long it might take based on the video, so hard to say if you might have to find a balance between the time it takes and those 30 points. In terms of passive options, it seems harder due to this motion, but there are certain solutions that your teams might want to explore.
And that brings us to mission 14, which is quite aptly towards the end of the list, since you want to complete it towards the end of a match. So you have gathered as many of those items as possible. You just want to make sure, because there is a no pieces rule on this mission, that you have let go of all those items before the end of a match. The timing for the minecart, which is one of the things that you can take into a forum area, is pretty unpredictable, and you definitely cannot rely on those points, as the team in front of you might be doing that mission much later on in the match than the time you were planning to go grab that minecart, or they might not be doing that mission at all. I think something to note is that since this mission hinges on a lot of other missions, some items are going to be harder than others to secure, and so that also impacts how hard it is to secure points on dropping them in the forum. And another thing to note is that since those items have to touch a mat and you can't have any pieces touching them at the end of the match, you can't just simply use a basket and dump it all in that area, or at least you need to potentially use a motor to be able to drop those items or remove whatever box or whatever container you've chosen to transport them. But of course, there are passive options to remove such things or to let go of items. And definitely, due to the timing we were mentioning and also the location right in the center of the mat, it doesn't look like you're going to be doing this as much as in a drive-by strategy as other missions.
And finally, that brings us to mission 15, site marking. So basically, sites with a flag at least partially inside and touching the mat give you 10 points each. So you get three of these little tan pieces with red flags on them, and there are three sites to put them in. A quick note is that the scoring is sites with a flag at least partially inside of it, and not flags placed inside of this of the sites. Therefore, you can't put multiple of these pieces inside of a single site. In terms of apparent difficulty, the target areas are quite small, although the one inside of the ship might be easier to kind of drop into because of the frame of the mission model. In terms of drive-by scoring, that makes a lot of sense because they're really spread out on the map. And timing, it's really up to you to choose the right moment so you don't risk knocking them away later after other missions. And for example, for the target area inside of the ship, you'll have to do that after mission 12 because the hull of the ship is actually covering the drop zone. In terms of passive options, probably need a certain motion to drop or to release the flag, but there are ways to trigger that movement.
And then that brings us to the precision tokens. So the point of precision tokens is that you get 6 of them. And anytime you take the robot away from the match table and you are outside of home, which is called an interruption, you lose one of those precision tokens. And what you can see here is that you are essentially getting a free interruption because you get as many points from 6 tokens as you do from 5. So you can take that into account for your strategy. You could either consider that to be your safety. So if anything goes wrong on a match table and you need to retrieve a robot, you can do it without losing any points, and you only keep that in case of an emergency. Or you can see it strategically as a way to save time. So, for example, if a robot is really far away, you can pick it up and bring it back to a launch area and spare yourself those precious seconds where it's heading back from that launch area. However, if you decide to use an interruption strategically, be very mindful of the rules on it, and more specifically on the rules concerning the cargo. So that's whatever you are carrying, whatever pieces of emission models you are carrying when you are doing the interruption, because you could lose some of them at that point. Now, of course, everything that we've just said is just our understanding of how the models work and how the rules apply. In case of any doubts or at any point of the season, please always go back to the robot game rules to make sure that you've understood them correctly. And also keep an eye on the updates because they can clarify certain parts of the rules. And so then you can make sure that your strategy is still applicable.
So now let's move on to the project, and we'll use this to talk about getting into the theme more broadly. So obviously there are a lot of options this year. Um, of course, for fun introduction to the theme, you could always watch a few adventure movies that are archaeology themed, like one of a classic that's sort of related to this might be Goonies, just to get into the spirit. get that core values going, whether you're a seasoned team with new members or a completely new team where you don't know anybody. And there are a bunch of other things that you can do to kind of get your minds thinking and starting to talk about what the theme solutions you might explore are. So that might be going to museums, whether that's ancient history or natural history museums, and watching basically every archaeology, ancient history documentary to Grace Television. For example, while it was unrelated to the themes, we watched Expedition Unknown on Discovery Channel. I think now it's on HBO Max, during lunches during RFL time. And I think I've seen a few archaeologists on YouTube, so be sure to check them out and kind of ask them questions or recommendations about their job. Though there are probably just a few of them, so don't hound them too much. Um, so we'll be posting a list of sources in the description that include websites and YouTube channels that you could check out. So be sure to look in that description.
More locally, you could be looking at landmarks like ruins, or if there are dig sites, or if a university nearby has an archaeology department, you could ask them if they would authorize visitors. Honestly, from experience, we can say that you'd be very surprised to see just how many experts are really happy to answer questions or to show an FLL team around their workplace. So don't be afraid to send emails, even if you don't know that expert personally, and just ask them politely. And maybe you can explain nicely that you're students and that you're doing FLL and that you want to find out more about their job. Or maybe later on in your project, once it's more developed, you can ask them for feedback on what you're doing.
So we're covering quite a broad range and depth and complexity of these resources. So some of them are more or less specific, some of them are just to introduce you to what archaeology is, whereas others are might be better suited to looking into a specific paper on a specific topic because that's what you want to apply your project to. Talking about papers, check out the authors as they can really be a great resource and experts to get in touch with, or maybe have an interview with them to get more insight. And then some resources to talk about how to work in archaeology in the case of the sparks and interests, like Into Orbit did for both me and Claire.
As for the project prompt, it's in the unearthed season. Your team's challenge is to identify a problem faced by archaeologists and propose a solution that can help. Of course, I don't think anyone was really surprised by this prompt. And when we were talking about experts, I think that this already identifies the main group of experts that you are going to be contacting this year, archaeologists.
However, this doesn't mean that you'll only interview archaeologists. For example, during the City Shaper season, which was about cities and buildings, we interviewed architects and construction workers to learn about the problems and know their opinion on whether or not they'd like to use our solution and what exactly their needs were for this product. Like having something lightweight and durable. But also, we interviewed specialists of the technology that we're using for our project, which happened to be RFID. So they could give us their input on more technical aspects of the solution, like warning us of the potential interferences from the rebar in concrete buildings. All this to say, once you identify a solution, also seek experts in that solution or in different components of the solution, whether they are technical or not.
I think that's all we had to say about the theme today. We are very excited to be heading into the unearthed season. Of course, if your team is still on vacation or if you haven't formed a team yet, don't worry and please don't feel like you're behind. It's also essential to rest between seasons and just take time to shift from one theme to the next and get excited about it. Of course, we wish all of you the best in this season, and we are very eager to see what teams come up with. So please feel free to tag us on Reddit or to post a comment telling us about what you're excited to learn this season, or to show us a really cool way you found to solve a mission. We'd be happy to see it. And of course, if you are interested in our content, we'll see you in the next video.